The Bennington case begins in the cool mountain air of southern Vermont, where you can almost feel the paper of the old file soften beneath your hands tonight. Settle in slowly, because nothing here asks to be solved in a hurry. We are only opening the folder, listening to the quiet, and letting the old roads of Bennington County appear one by one. You can picture the first page if you'd like, with its faint typewriter marks and its careful names, and with the Bennington case written across it like a question that never quite learned how to rest. Outside the window, the green mountains would be dark by now, their ridges folded together under a patient sky. Inside, there is the low sound of a desk lamp warming, the dry smell of paper, and the sense that many people have sat with this same file before you. Bennington is not a loud place in these records. It comes through softly, in roads bordered by trees, in college paths, in a bus station bench, in the damp hush of fields after rain. You turn the page, and the town does not announce itself as strange. It feels ordinary, which is part of why the file has always been so difficult to close. For many years, people have used a larger phrase for this cluster of vanishings, the Bennington Triangle, though that name came later, after the disappearances had already settled into local memory. Tonight, we can hold that phrase gently, without letting it turn the people inside the file into legends. They were not symbols. They were hikers, students, neighbors, family members, and tired travelers, each with a real morning behind them, and someone expecting them home. When you sit with the Bennington case long enough, the first thing you notice is not a single clue, but a pattern of absence. A person leaves a familiar place, in daylight or in ordinary weather, and then the record grows thin. Searchers go out. Dogs are brought in. Roads are checked. Wooded slopes are walked again and again, until the soles of boots soften with mud. The old reports do not have the comfort of modern certainty. There are no phones in pockets, no quick location trails, no camera networks quietly saving images in the background. There are only witnesses, maps, memory, weather, and the patience of people willing to walk through brush because one small sign might matter. You can feel how slow that work must have been, how much of it depended on human eyes and cold hands. The mountains around Bennington do not need drama to feel vast. Even a modest hill can become complicated when leaves cover a path, when shadows gather early, or when winter light makes distance hard to judge. You look down at the file, and then out toward those dark ridges in your mind, and you understand why investigators sometimes had to work without knowing whether they were following a trail, a rumor, or only hope. The earliest disappearance usually placed in this quiet pattern belongs to a man named Middie, an experienced local guide who knew the land with the familiarity of long habit. On the 12th of November, 1945, he was guiding a hunting party near the mountains east of Bennington. By the accounts that survived, he was not a stranger to those woods. He was the sort of person others trusted to know the way. You can imagine that morning without sharpening it into fear. The air would have held a November edge, clean and dry in the lungs, with fallen leaves pressed flat beneath boots. The hunters moved through the forest at a human pace, pausing, listening, speaking in low, practical voices. Somewhere in that ordinary rhythm, rivers went ahead, or stepped aside, or drifted just far enough from the group that the story changed. What detectives and searchers had afterward was a gap, not a dramatic scene, not a clear turn, only the kind of silence that begins almost politely and then refuses to end. The search began in country he should have understood better than almost anyone else there. That fact sits heavily in the file, because you keep returning to it, as every investigator must have done. A man who knows the woods can still meet trouble in the woods. A wrong step, a hidden hollow, sudden illness, weather, confusion, and all the small accidents that need no witness can happen even to the experienced. We know that, and the investigators knew it too. Yet knowledge does not make a search easier when no trace offers itself. You turn another page, and the paper carries the faint grit of age. The details are spare. There were searches in the area, and there was the stubborn fact that Rivers did not come back. At some point, a rifle cartridge, or a small item linked to him, was reportedly found near a stream, but nothing that could calmly explain the whole matter. It is important to let that uncertainty remain plain. The Bennington case has often been retold in a way that makes the mountains seem almost alive with intention, but detectives could not build a case on atmosphere. They had terrain, timing, and a missing man. They had search parties moving through trees, calling a name into cold air, and waiting for an answer that never came. As you sit beside the lamp tonight, you can feel the difference between a mystery and a case file. A mystery can drift and gather mist around itself. A case file has to stay with particulars. It asks where the person was last seen, who was nearby, what the weather was doing, how far a person could travel, and where the search had already gone. For Rivers, those particulars never lined up into an answer. The wooded slopes kept their silence, and the community carried on with a new uneasiness folded into familiar trails. You can imagine the searchers returning at dusk, coats smelling of leaves and smoke, their faces tired from looking too closely at every broken branch. This is the first quiet lesson of the Bennington case. Even the patient work of many people can meet a wall made only of distance, weather, and time. But the file does not stay with Middie Rivers alone, and when the next page comes forward, the place grows wider, because a young woman named Paula Welden steps into the record near the first day of December, 1946. Paula Welden was a student at Bennington College, and her part of the Bennington case begins in a world of dormitory rooms, wool coats, weekend plans, and the young restlessness of someone who wants to walk. She was 18 years old. On the 1st of December 1946, she left campus wearing clothes that later seemed too light for the weather, and she headed toward the long trail. You can picture the campus at that hour, quiet, but not empty. A door closes, steps cross a path. The air has that early winter thinness, carrying the smell of damp wool, old wood, and cold stone. Someone sees her, or thinks they see her, and the image becomes one of the small anchors investigators later try to hold. The long trail was not an obscure place, and yet it was not a city street. It moved north and south through Vermont, through wooded ground and mountain country, and it could receive a walker gently at first. For Paula, the early part of the route was ordinary enough that witnesses reportedly remembered seeing a young woman making her way along. These sightings would matter because, in a case with so little physical evidence, memory became one of the few tools left. You sit with those witness accounts the way a detective might, not forcing them to say more than they can. A person saw a young woman near a road. Another remembered her asking about the trail. Someone else placed her near the entrance or along the way. Each recollection has weight, but each one also has edges softened by time, attention, distance, and the ordinary uncertainty of human seeing. The search for Paula Welden became large and serious. Students, faculty, police, and volunteers joined in. Planes were used. The ground was checked. The trail and surrounding areas were searched again and again. You can hear the old rhythm of that work. Boots through leaves, car doors closing, voices carrying in the cold, paper maps unfolding with a dry crackle in gloved hands. Detectives in 1946 did not have the tools we might imagine now. They could not pull a digital trail from a device. They could not compare a day of movements against a web of automatic records. They had interviews, telephone calls, printed notices, and the slow physical act of going where a missing person might have gone. That meant the investigation depended deeply on patience. There were theories, of course. A person might have left by choice. A person might have become lost. A person might have been met by someone. A person might have suffered an accident in land that could hide a human form with leaves, snow, and slope. But theories are not answers, and every quiet detective learns the difference. You can imagine returning to the same witness statement at midnight, reading it once, then again, with the lamp making a pale circle on the desk. Did the witness see Paula clearly? Did the clothing match? Did any car pass? Did anyone notice her turning away from the trail? The file gives you questions in layers, and each layer has to be handled gently. Paula's father, William Welden, became deeply involved in the search and in the criticism of how it had been handled. That human detail matters. Behind every procedural decision, there is a family waiting, and waiting changes the air in every room it enters. You can feel it in the silence after a phone rings, in the scrape of a chair, in the way people stop speaking when there is no news. The Paula Welden case drew attention beyond Bennington, and over time it became one of the central disappearances people remembered when they spoke of the Bennington mystery. Yet attention did not solve it. Public interest can brighten a file for a while, but brightness is not the same as evidence. The days lengthened into weeks, and then into years, and Paula did not come home. As you sit with this part of the Bennington case, you begin to understand why detectives could never simply let it go, and also why they could never force it open. The last known movements were too few. The landscape was too broad. The possible explanations were too many. And the evidence, the calm, hard kind that can bear weight across decades, was almost entirely missing. The file grows quiet again after Paula. It does not close, but it becomes the kind of silence that cold cases know well. Papers are placed in folders. Names are remembered. Someone checks a lead months later, perhaps years later, because a small new statement has come in, or because an old one seems different now. That is patient detective work. Not glamorous, not quick, and often done in rooms where the only sound is a clock and the turning of pages. And then, as you move deeper into the box, another name appears in the Bennington case, and the setting changes from a mountain trail to the ordinary waiting space of a bus. James Tedford was an older man, a veteran, and his disappearance is usually placed on the 1st of December 1949, 3 years to the day after Paula Welden vanished. He had been staying at the soldiers' home in Bennington, and he was returning by bus from a trip to St. Albans. The route should have brought him back to familiar ground. It was public, scheduled, and simple enough to seem safe. You can imagine the bus in winter, its windows faintly clouded by breath, its seats worn smooth by many coats and many small journeys. There is the low vibration underfoot, the smell of damp fabric, cigarette smoke lingering from that era, and the muffled sound of tires over cold road. A passenger might doze. A passenger might look out at fields and houses sliding past. A passenger might hold a paper or a small bag in his lap. The accounts often say that Tedford was seen on the bus after its last stop before Bennington, and then, when the bus arrived, he was gone. His belongings were reportedly still there. That detail has made the story feel especially strange in retellings, but as we read it tonight, we keep our voices low and our questions careful. The task is not to make the absence larger than it is, but to understand why it was so hard to explain. A bus is a contained space, but not a perfect one. People board and leave. Drivers watch the road. Passengers look away. Stops are brief. Memory blurs around routine. If something happens during an ordinary trip, investigators must reconstruct it from people who may not have known they were witnessing anything important. You can feel how fragile that kind of evidence is. Tedford's disappearance did not offer the same landscape problem as the trail cases, yet it carried its own difficulty. If he left the bus, where did that happen? If he did not leave in an obvious way, why did nobody notice? If the belongings were truly left behind, what did that suggest? Every question opens another small drawer, and most of those drawers are empty. Detectives working with a case like this had to depend on interviews. They had to speak with the driver, with passengers, with staff at the soldiers' home, with anyone who might have seen Tedford before or after the journey. They had to check stations, roads, hospitals, and places where an older man might have gone if confused or unwell. It was practical work, repetitive work, and it had to be done before memories cooled. You can almost hear the pencil moving across a notebook as each answer is written down. The room might smell of coffee left too long on a warmer, of wet overcoats, of tobacco in the seams of the furniture. Someone asks the same question in a slightly different way. Someone waits while a witness searches memory for the shape of a face, a seat number, a moment when the bus door opened. The date tied Tedford's case to Paula Welden in the public imagination, and that tie has lasted. Yet coincidence, even striking coincidence, is not proof. Detectives know this, and when you read beside them, you learn to hold two things at once. The pattern may matter, and the pattern may also mislead. In the Bennington case, that balance becomes part of the work. Too much imagination can turn every shadow into a sign. Too little imagination can miss a connection that should have been considered. The patient investigator has to stand between those risks, in a narrow, quiet place, accepting uncertainty without becoming careless. Tedford was not found. The bus route, the witnesses, the belongings and the date remained pieces that did not join into a finished picture. For those who knew him, the mystery was not an interesting puzzle. It was an absence in a room, a bed not slept in, a return that never happened. We keep that human scale close, because the file deserves that much care. By now, you may feel the Bennington case changing shape under your hands. It is no longer only the woods, and no longer only the trail. It is a region, a set of years, and a series of disappearances that resist being held as one thing. You turn the page slowly, and the paper seems to ask whether a pattern can be real, even when its parts remain separate. The next section brings us back toward open ground and family memory, where another child of the Bennington area steps into the record, and the quiet becomes especially tender. Paul Jepson was 8 years old when he disappeared on the 12th of October 1950 from an area near Bennington. He was with his mother, who was tending to animals, and for a short span of time he was out of sight. That is the kind of sentence a file can state plainly, though anyone who has ever cared for a child knows how much feeling lives inside it. A few minutes can become a lifetime afterward. You can picture the farm setting in soft autumn detail. There is the smell of hay and animal feed, the rough grain of wooden boards, the coolness of October air resting on the skin. Somewhere nearby, work continues in the ordinary way work does, because no one yet knows that the day is changing. A child is there, and then he is not. The search for Paul Jepson was immediate and deeply personal. Searchers moved through the surrounding land, calling for him, checking paths, fields, and nearby wooded areas. Dogs were reportedly brought in, and some accounts say they followed a scent toward a highway, though the certainty of that detail varies in later tellings. You can feel why investigators would return to it, because a scent trail, even an uncertain one, offers direction when everything else is open space. For detectives, the disappearance of a child brings a particular kind of pressure, though we will keep it gentle here. The work becomes urgent in practice, but tonight we speak of it softly, because the people in the file were already carrying enough. They had to ask who had been nearby, what vehicles had passed, whether the child might have wandered, and how far small feet could have traveled across uneven ground. Every possibility had to be considered without turning away from any other too soon. You sit with the map and imagine the search grid forming in pencil. A road here, a field there, a line of trees, a barn, a place where a child might hide, rest, or become confused. The map is not only geography now, it is time, fear, hope, and the repeated human effort to make unknown ground speak. In 1950, Investigators did not have the later advantages of modern child recovery alerts, instant broadcast networks, or forensic tools that could test tiny traces in ways unimaginable then. They had neighbors, officers, volunteers, dogs, and daylight. They had questions repeated at doors. They had vehicles stopping along roads. They had the slow ache of searching the same area again because the first search might have missed something small. Paul's disappearance became folded into the larger Bennington story because of its place, its date, and the troubling nearness to other unresolved cases. Yet it also stood alone, as each case must. A child was missing from a particular family, in a particular place, on a particular day. We honor the wider pattern only by not losing the individual life inside it. The old accounts sometimes lean towards speculation, because speculation grows where evidence does not. But tonight, you and I can let the speculation stay outside the circle of lamplight. Inside the circle, there is a child, a farm, an October day, a search, and no answer. That is enough to sit with. If you were the detective returning to Paul's file years later, you might begin with the witness timeline. You might mark the mother's movements, the last certain sighting, the time when alarm began, and the first places searched. Then you might look for what was not recorded, because old files often speak through their gaps. A missing time, an unnamed passerby, a road not checked until later, a detail remembered differently by two people who both meant well. This is why the Bennington case could never be cracked by simple confidence. It did not present one locked door with one hidden key. It presented many doors, some leading into woods, some into memory, some into ordinary days that had not been preserved carefully, because nobody knew they would become important. Detectives had to work with what remained, and what remained was thin. Paul Jepson was not recovered, and the file did not receive the answer his family needed. Over time, his name was repeated beside the others, sometimes too quickly, as though the list itself were the point. But when you slow down, as we are doing now, each name takes its own space again. Each one has its own weather. The Bennington case becomes most human in that slowing down. The mystery is not only what happened, it is how people keep searching when the world offers no clear reply. It is how a mother remembers the last ordinary minute. It is how a detective reads the same page in a colder season, hoping that age might make some detail stand out at last. And while that hope remained, another disappearance entered the record in the same month, bringing searchers once more into the fields and woods near Glastonbury. Frieda Langer disappeared on the 28th of October 1950, only a little more than 2 weeks after Paul Jepson. She was 53 years old, and she had been hiking or walking with a relative near the Somerset Reservoir area, close to the old ghost town country of Glastonbury. In many accounts, she slipped or got wet, then decided to return to camp to change her clothing. She did not arrive. You can feel the dampness in that detail. Wet clothing in late October has a particular chill, clinging at the cuffs and knees, making each step less comfortable. The ground near water can be uneven, with roots under leaves and stones slick beneath the surface. A person may turn back for the most ordinary reason, wanting dry clothes, warmth, and the small relief of getting comfortable again. The search that followed was extensive. Planes flew over the region. Search parties moved through difficult terrain. People checked roads, trails, cabins, and wooded places where a walker might have gone astray. You can imagine the sound of an aircraft passing overhead, small against the sky, while below it searchers pushed through brush that snapped softly against their coats. Frieda Langer's case is different from several of the others because, months later, her remains were found in an open area that had reportedly been searched before. We will speak of that gently, and without dwelling on anything that does not help the quiet work of understanding. The discovery answered one question, but not the larger one. It showed where she was found, yet it did not clearly explain how she had come to be there, or why earlier searchers had not located her. For detectives, that kind of discovery can be both relief and difficulty. It gives the file a physical point on the map. It allows a family to know something real. But it can also deepen uncertainty when the location seems inconsistent with the search history, or when the passage of time has taken away the details that might have clarified the path. You can feel the investigators returning to their maps, tracing lines again with tired fingers. The land around Glastonbury had already gathered a reputation by then. It was a place of abandoned settlement, old logging history, rough country, and stories told with a lowered voice. Yet detectives could not treat reputation as evidence. They had to ask practical questions. Where was Frieda last seen? What route would she likely have taken? What weather moved in? Who searched which area, and when? You turn the page, and the file offers the familiar texture of patient work. A search report, a witness statement, a map folded along weakened creases, perhaps a clipping, yellowed at the edge, its ink a little soft from time. These things do not solve the Bennington case by themselves, but they show the steady labor that surrounded it. There is compassion in that labor. Searchers walk because someone is missing. Detectives ask questions because a family cannot rest. Volunteers return to a slope because the first pass might not have been enough. Even when the outcome is uncertain, the act of looking is a kind of promise, and the old Bennington files are full of that promise. With Frieda Langer, the searchers did eventually find her, but the explanation remained incomplete. The case did not become simple. It became another quiet piece of a wider set of questions, one more page in a folder that never settled into a single theory. And, because her disappearance came so close after Paul's, the public memory of the Bennington case grew stronger. As you sit with these names together, it is tempting to let the pattern take over. Middie Rivers in 1945, Paula Welden in 1946, James Tedford in 1949, Paul Jepson and Frieda Langer in 1950. The sequence has a rhythm that can feel almost too neat, but patient detective work asks us to be careful with rhythm. A list can sound like proof when it is only a list. That care is part of why detectives could never crack the Bennington case. They had to respect the possibility of connection, but they also had to respect the differences. A guide in the woods, a college student on a trail, an older man on a bus, a child near a farm, and a woman returning to camp do not form one easy story. They form a difficult question, and the question has remained open because the evidence never gave investigators permission to narrow it cleanly. Still, the human mind looks for shape. Yours does too, as you read. Mine does, as we sit here together in the quiet. We notice the geography, the years, the repeated absence, and the old roads leading toward wooded ground. Then we remind ourselves that noticing is only the beginning, never the proof. The next thing in the file is not another disappearance, but the landscape itself, because to understand why the Bennington case resisted detectives for so long, we have to spend time with the place that held so many of the questions. The next thing in the file is not another disappearance, but the landscape itself, because to understand why the Bennington case resisted detectives for so long, we have to spend time with the place that held so many of the questions. You lay the map flat beneath the lamp, and the paper seems almost too still for what it represents. Roads bend softly around hills, trails thin into wooded lines, and the old names of places sit there in black ink, quiet and patient. Bennington County has a way of looking gentle from a distance, especially when you imagine it under snow or autumn color. But a detective does not get to study a landscape only from a distance. You have to think of wet leaves underfoot, low branches at eye level, sudden dips in the ground, and paths that seem obvious until light begins to fail. A hill can be small on a map and confusing under a gray sky. Glastonbury in particular asks for slow attention. It was once a town with industry, homes, logging, and people who believed the place would keep growing. Then it faded. By the time these disappearances became part of the Bennington case, Glastonbury already carried the feeling of a place that had been used, left, and partly taken back by the woods. You can almost smell the old timber and the damp moss at the edges of forgotten roads. When investigators searched around Glastonbury and the nearby trails, they were not moving through a clean diagram. They were moving through weather, slope, brush, and uncertainty. A person could be close and still hidden. A voice could be swallowed by trees. Tracks could soften under rain, vanish beneath leaves, or be crossed by searchers before anyone knew they mattered. We should let that difficulty sit plainly on the table. The Bennington case is often remembered because the vanishings feel strange together, but the land itself made ordinary explanations hard to confirm. If someone wandered, there were too many possible directions. If someone was injured, there were too many places a body could be concealed by natural cover. If someone met another person, there were too few witnesses to fix the meeting in place. You see how the file keeps opening without widening into proof. A detective reviewing the landscape would begin with distances, not legends. How far could Middie Rivers move from the hunting party? How long would Paula Welden need to reach the long trail? Where could James Tedford have left the bus, if he did leave it? Which road might Paul Jepson have reached? What route might Frieda have taken back toward camp? The questions are practical, but they do not become simple. You can feel the work in your hands as you trace those routes. The paper map is smooth where it has been folded many times, and the pencil you hold leaves a faint gray pressure along the roads. Outside your imagined window, rain taps softly at the glass. Inside, the Bennington case waits while you measure miles that once had to be walked by real people in real cold. Searches in mountain country have a special kind of patience. A line of volunteers moves through brush, each person watching the ground, the trees, the ditches, and the spaces under fallen limbs. It is tiring work because everything becomes important. A torn cloth, a footprint, a broken twig, a place where leaves seem disturbed. Even a smell in the air can make searchers pause. Most pauses lead nowhere. That is one reason old searches can look incomplete from the comfort of a later year. You and I can sit with the file and wonder why an area was missed, or why a clue was not preserved in the way we would expect now. But those searchers were not reading a finished story. They were standing in weather, with limited daylight, limited tools, and a growing circle of possible ground. The file deserves that fairness. In the Bennington case, terrain and time worked together. Each hour after a disappearance stretched the search area outward, even when everyone hoped the missing person was nearby. A person on foot might double back, leave a road, accept a ride, find shelter, or become disoriented. A person who intended only a short walk might have no food, no proper clothing, and no clear plan beyond returning soon. Ordinary choices became difficult to interpret afterward. You turn back to Paula Welden's route, because her path has always drawn careful attention. The long trail was known, yet it was not a controlled space. A student walking there in early December could be seen by several people and still pass beyond the reach of definite knowledge. You can imagine her red coat, often mentioned in retellings, not as a symbol, but as a small human detail against a muted Vermont afternoon. Witnesses said what they remembered. That is all witnesses can ever do. One person may remember color, another may remember time, another may remember a manner, a question, or the direction someone seemed to be going. By the time detectives gather those memories, each has already begun to settle into the mind in its own way, and you have to handle them like thin paper. For Paula, some accounts placed her near the trail entrance or along the road leading toward it. Others became less certain as the search widened. The more attention a case receives, the more possible sightings tend to arrive, and not all of them can be true. You can hear the detective's pencil hesitate above the notebook, weighing each caller's confidence against distance, timing, and the ordinary mistakes people make without meaning to. This is where patience becomes more than waiting. Patience is the discipline of not forcing a witness statement to become what you need it to be. It is the quiet refusal to turn a faint recollection into a certainty. We sit with that discipline tonight because it is one of the reasons the Bennington case stayed unresolved. There was too much that could be imagined, and too little that could be proved. The old file would have contained names, times, and places written in the language of official record, but around those words, there is another texture. You can feel a campus growing anxious, students speaking in low voices, a telephone ringing in a hall, boots drying near a door after another day of searching. The smell of wet wool and floor wax belongs in this story as much as any theory does. When no answer comes quickly, a case changes. The first hours are physical, full of motion. The later days become administrative and emotional, full of interviews, notices, repeated questions, and the slow sorting of what has already been tried. Weeks later, the file begins to thicken. Months later, it becomes something a detective must choose to reopen, because the world has already moved on in visible ways. You can imagine that choice. A detective reaches for the Bennington folder when other work is pressing, because one old question still feels unfinished. The folder may be soft at the corners. The carbon copies may have faded. The photographs may smell faintly of dust and chemical paper. Still, the file asks to be read again, and so you read it with him. The difficulty was not only physical evidence, it was also jurisdiction, communication, and the age of the investigative world. Police departments, state authorities, local officers, college officials, families, and volunteers all had pieces of information. Those pieces did not always move as quickly or as cleanly as they would now. A phone call could be missed. A note could be delayed. A witness might speak first to one person and later to another. In a modern case, we often expect coordination to appear almost instantly. But in the Bennington years, coordination had to be built by hand. Someone typed a notice, someone placed a call, someone drove to ask a question in person, someone carried information back. The pace was human, and the file still holds that pace, like the slow ticking of a clock in a courthouse hallway. That slower world did not mean people cared less. If anything, you can feel their care in the labor required. They walked ground without easy maps on a screen. They spoke to neighbors face to face. They searched barns, fields, hillsides, and roads, in weather that left hands stiff and coats heavy. They did not have certainty, but they had the willingness to keep looking. The Bennington case also suffered from the way stories grow when official answers do not. Rumor enters softly at first, almost like another witness. Someone heard a car. Someone saw a stranger. Someone remembered a conversation that might have meant nothing at the time. With each retelling, edges can sharpen or drift, and after enough years, the investigator has to separate memory from folklore as gently as possible. You can sit with a rumor without despising it. Often, rumor is only a community trying to make sense of distress. People speak because silence feels too heavy. They repeat details because repetition gives shape to worry. But detectives cannot charge a rumor with carrying the weight of a case, and they cannot build an answer from a feeling alone. That is another quiet limit. The phrase Bennington Triangle came after the main disappearances, and it gave the public a way to hold them together. A phrase can be useful. It can also be misleading. You and I can use it carefully, knowing that it gathers several unresolved events under one umbrella without proving they had one cause. The file beneath the phrase is still made of separate people, separate days, and separate paths. Middie rivers belonged to the woods in a way that later readers may find reassuring until they remember that knowing a place is not the same as being protected by it. Paula Welden belonged, at least for that season, to the college world and the long trail. James Tedford belonged to the public routine of a bus journey. Paul Jepson belonged to a family place. Frieda belonged to a walk that should have ended at camp. When you list them too quickly, the names blur. When you slow down, they separate again. That separation matters because detectives had to ask whether they were looking at one hidden pattern or several unrelated losses. Each possibility changed the work. A connected theory would require links. An unconnected explanation would require humility. Neither path gave them enough. The file on James Tedford especially reminds us that geography alone could not solve the Bennington case. His disappearance was tied to a bus, not a mountain trail, and that makes it both more contained and more puzzling. You return to that bus in your mind, to the warm, stale air, the window fog, the soft jostle of luggage, and the passengers absorbed in their own quiet journeys. If Tedford had stepped off before Bennington, someone might have seen him. If he became confused, someone might have noticed. If the account of his belongings is accurate, then those objects become small witnesses of their own. A bag, a timetable, a seat, a folded paper, whatever remained there would have been handled with care in the telling, because objects can feel strangely faithful when a person is gone. But objects do not explain themselves. You can place them on a desk and study them for hours. You can note their condition, their location, their ordinary use. Still, they cannot say whether their owner left willingly, accidentally, under confusion, or under circumstances no one recognized in time. In the Tedford portion of the Bennington case, that silence sits in the seat beside you. Detectives would have had to rebuild the journey from living memory. Who boarded where? Who sat near him? How crowded was the bus? Did the driver stop between scheduled points? Did anyone recall him speaking, sleeping, standing, or moving down the aisle? Each answer might help, but only if it could be fixed to the right moment. The bus kept moving while memory tried to catch up. This is the kind of investigative work that rarely appears dramatic, because it is made of repetition. You ask one person, then another. You compare times. You return to the driver with a new question. You check the schedule again. You look at the road in winter light and ask where an older man could have gone unnoticed. The work is slow because the truth, if it is there, may be hidden in something very small. In the Bennington case, small things often failed to become enough. A possible sighting did not become a confirmed path. A search area did not become a discovery. A date did not become a connection. A rumor did not become evidence. The frustration is quiet but deep, and you can feel why investigators might have carried it for years. Yet frustration is not failure in the simple sense. A detective can do honest work and still not receive an answer. Searchers can cover ground and still miss what time, weather, or terrain has hidden. Witnesses can speak sincerely and still be mistaken. Families can hope with all their strength and still be met with silence. The Bennington case is a lesson in those human limits. You place Tedford's page beside Paula's in your mind, and then beside Paul's. Different settings, different ages, different circumstances. A pattern is possible, but certainty is not. That is the narrow space where the case has lived for decades. It is not empty space. It is filled with questions, but questions are not the same as a solved case. The old investigative tools had their own tactile world. Fingerprint ink could feel slightly tacky on the skin. Typewriter keys struck paper with a hard, even sound. Carbon copies left smudges on fingertips. File folders smelled of dust, glue, and handled paper. You can almost hear a drawer sliding open in a police office. The metal rails whispering as the Bennington file comes forward again. A modern listener may wonder why there was no definitive forensic turn, no single laboratory result that changed everything. The answer is partly that the cases produced very little recoverable evidence. In some, there was no known scene to test. In others, too much time or weather had passed. Frieda Langer's discovery came after months outdoors, and the information available from it was limited by the realities of that era. Forensics cannot work on absence alone. You need something to examine. A garment, a trace, a clear location, a preserved object, a known contact point. Many parts of the Bennington case gave investigators only last sightings and missing routes. You can see why later technology, powerful as it became, had little to grasp when the original evidence was so thin. Cold case units often thrive when old evidence has been saved well. A sealed envelope, a retained slide, a box of clothing stored in a dry room, a sample that newer science can read differently. But the Bennington disappearances were not all the kind of cases that left such materials behind. Many of the central questions were about movement through open space, and open space is not careful with clues. You turn another imagined page, and the sound is soft as breath. The Bennington case asks for a kind of acceptance that is not surrender. It asks you to accept that detectives may have looked sincerely, thought carefully, and still had no final answer. That is difficult, because we often want effort to lead somewhere visible, but some files become records of devotion more than records of resolution. Consider the searches around Paula Welden again. The Long Trail area would have changed from hour to hour as light shifted, shadows lengthened, and cold settled into the ground. Volunteers might have returned with scratched hands, damp socks, and the dull ache of climbing. Someone would have marked areas as covered. Someone else might have wondered whether covered ever truly meant finished in country like that. The same question follows Frieda Langer. If her remains were found in an area believed to have been searched, what does that mean? It may mean the earlier search missed her. It may mean the area was not searched as thoroughly as memory later suggested. It may mean the exact location was misunderstood in later accounts. Or it may mean something more complicated. The file does not give enough to choose with certainty. A patient narrator has to resist making that uncertainty more dramatic than it is. We can simply acknowledge it. Search work is hard. Ground is uneven. Human attention has limits. Reports can be imprecise. Later retellings can smooth over confusion until a strange detail seems sharper than the original record allowed. You and I keep our hands open around the facts. That open-handedness is the spirit of the Bennington case tonight. We are not here to solve it by force. We are here to understand why it stayed beyond reach. The answer, if we can call it that, is not one thing. It is landscape, time, limited evidence, separate circumstances, imperfect memory, and the slow thickening of legend around a set of real losses. Each of those forces can be felt in the old rooms where the case was handled. Imagine a small office after dark, with a radiator clicking softly and snow collecting along the window frame. A detective sits with a cup gone cold, reading a witness statement from years before. The paper has a faint onion skin translucence, and the ink looks both official and fragile. You sit there too, quietly. Maybe the detective is looking for a repeated name. Maybe he is checking whether a car description appeared in more than one account. Maybe he is comparing the weather on the day Paula walked with the weather on the day Frieda turned back toward camp. He knows the chances are slim. Still, he reads. This is how patience appears in real life, not grand, just steady. The Bennington case also raises the question of how communities remember. Bennington had ordinary life before, during, and after these disappearances. People still bought groceries, attended classes, shoveled snow, repaired fences, waited for buses, and walked familiar roads. A cold case does not stop a town from living. It simply becomes part of the background air, present even when no one is speaking of it. For families, that background is more personal. The missing person is not a local mystery, but a place at the table. A birthday, a photograph, a voice remembered in a room. You can feel why official uncertainty hurts in a special way. Without a clear answer, grief has to keep adjusting itself. It cannot settle fully into one shape. Detectives are human inside that uncertainty too. They may learn to speak in careful phrases, because careful phrases are the only honest ones. They may say, there is no new development. They may say they are still willing to receive information. They may say the case remains open. Under those words is a quieter truth. Someone has kept the folder, and someone still knows where it is. When we read the Bennington case as listeners, we inherit a small responsibility. We can be curious without being careless. We can wonder without turning real people into decorations for a strange story. We can notice the eerie shape of the sequence while still remembering that detectives had to live in evidence, not in mood. That distinction keeps the room calm. The title asks why detectives could never crack the Bennington case, and as you sit with these papers, you begin to hear the answer in the texture of the pages. They could not crack it because there may not have been one shell to crack. There may have been several separate disappearances, each difficult for its own reasons, later gathered by geography and memory into one larger mystery. Or there may have been links that evidence never preserved. Either way, the file did not yield. It did not give one witness who saw enough, one object that explained enough, one place that contained enough, or one confession that could be tested against known facts. It gave fragments. Some fragments were clear, some were uncertain, some may have grown in the telling. Detectives had to sort them in the dim light available. You can almost feel the quiet ache of that sorting. The chair creaks, the lamp hums, the air smells faintly of paper, dust, and rain-soaked wool from a coat hung near the door. A page about Middie rivers lies beside a clipping about Paula Welden. A note about James Tedford rests near a map of Glastonbury. None of them answers the others. The Bennington case is not unique in that way, though its grouping is memorable. Many cold cases endure, because the first window for evidence closes before anyone understands how small that window was. A witness moves away. Weather changes ground. A road is resurfaced. A building is renovated. An officer retires. A family member dies. Time does not erase everything at once. It thins the file gradually. That thinning can be heard in old language. Reports say apparently, possibly, believed, last seen, may have, reportedly. Those words are not weakness, they are honesty. They remind you that investigators were trying to describe uncertainty without pretending it was knowledge. In a sleep story like this, those words can feel almost like breaths, because they keep us from forcing the dark to speak. The Bennington disappearances came before the great cultural expectation that every mystery must have a resolution waiting in the final act. Real investigations do not obey that structure. Sometimes they move forward, sometimes they circle, sometimes they pause for years. Sometimes they are reopened because a person makes a call, or because a new detective sees an old note differently. Sometimes nothing changes except the age of the paper. You can imagine a later investigator, perhaps many years after 1950, pulling the Bennington material again. The world outside is different now. Cars are different. Phones are different. The science is different. Yet the core of the case remains stubbornly old. Where did she go? Who saw him last? Was the trail searched fully? Could the bus account be wrong? Did anyone notice a stranger, a vehicle, a sound? Even with new thinking, the old limitations stay. A map can be re-examined, but it cannot recreate weather. A witness statement can be reread, but it cannot restore a witness's fresh memory. A theory can be tested against known facts, but if the facts are few, many theories can survive. That is not satisfying, but it is true, and true is kinder than false certainty. The sensory world of the Bennington case keeps returning, because it helps us understand those limits. Wet leaves hide tracks, snow changes ground, cold affects bodies, judgment, and search conditions. Paper records fade, voices on telephones carry urgency, but not always precision. A bus aisle is narrow, but attention can be elsewhere. A farmyard can feel enclosed, yet a child can pass beyond sight with startling speed. You and I sit with each of those realities, one at a time. We do not hurry them. The point is not to make the case feel impossible in a grand way. The point is to see how many ordinary difficulties can gather until an answer slips beyond reach. In Bennington, the unsolved quality was built from many small uncertainties, layered like leaves on a trail. There was also the problem of public fascination. Once a case becomes famous for being mysterious, new stories may arrive with their own weather. Some are sincere, Some are mistaken. Some are shaped by what people have already heard. Detectives must listen anyway, because the useful lead and the useless rumor may sound similar at first. That listening is patient, and it can be exhausting. Imagine taking a call years after Paula Welden vanished. The caller remembers a woman on a road, or a man speaking strangely, or a family story passed down at a kitchen table. You write it down. You ask for dates. You ask how they know. You compare it to the file. Most of the time, nothing holds. But you cannot know that until you check. And checking is the work. The same would be true for the wider Bennington case. Every possible lead had to be handled without allowing it to pull the investigation into fantasy. That balance is delicate. Too much skepticism and you may miss a late truth. Too much belief and you drown the file in noise. The best detectives learn a calm middle way, and tonight we borrow that calm. The mountains do not explain the case, but they shape its feeling. The Green Mountains have long slopes, wooded hollows, and weather that can change a simple walk. In summer, the forest can be thick and fragrant with leaf mold and sun-warmed bark. In autumn, the ground can look bright and clear while hiding rocks and holes under color. In winter, sound travels differently and distances seem both nearer and farther. You look again at the long trail. It was built for walking, but walking is never one thing. A confident walker, an unprepared walker, an injured walker, and a distracted walker all experience the same path differently. Paula Welden's walk remains open to interpretation because we do not know enough about her state of mind, her exact route, or what happened after the last reliable sighting. The trail keeps those questions. In some retellings, Paula's disappearance is treated as the center of the Bennington mystery. There is a reason for that. Her case drew broad attention, involved a college community, and left behind a stark image of a young woman heading toward a trail and not returning. But detectives could not solve an image. They needed evidence that connected that image to an outcome. The evidence did not come. Her father's concern about the investigation helped lead to changes in Vermont law enforcement history, particularly the strengthening of state-level policing after the criticism around her case. That detail tells you something important. Even when a case remains unsolved, it can still change institutions. A missing person can expose weaknesses in coordination, authority, and response. The file may not close, but the system around it may learn. You can feel the bittersweetness of that. Reform is not the same as return. Better procedures do not answer the family that waited. Yet they matter, because future searches may be stronger because of older pain. In that sense, the Bennington case became part of a larger story about how communities organize care when someone is missing. The lesson was practical, and it was paid for dearly. Middie Rivers's case taught another lesson, quieter and older. Familiar land can still defeat certainty. Searchers may assume an experienced guide must have chosen a route, found shelter, or known how to return. But experience does not make a person invulnerable. The woods do not keep account of who understands them. They simply are, with their cold streams, leaf cover, hidden drops, and long silences. If you close your eyes for a moment, you can imagine the searchers calling his name. The sound moves through trees, touches bark, fades into distance. Someone pauses to listen, and there is only wind and the small creak of branches. Then the line moves again. This is not a scene of drama. It is a scene of human persistence against a very large quiet. Paul Jepson's disappearance asks us to think about scale differently. For a child, the world is both smaller and larger than it is for an adult. A short distance can be far. A ditch can be a barrier. A road can be a danger or a direction. A stranger's words can carry too much weight. Detectives had to consider all of that while time moved quickly. You can imagine the first search around the farm as a series of urgent circles. Near the buildings first, then the edges, then the road, then the fields beyond what seemed likely. Every expansion carries a small sorrow, because it means the simple answer has not appeared. The air smells of earth and hay, and someone's voice grows hoarse from calling. The Bennington case keeps that sound inside it. Frieda Langer's case returns us to the problem of search coverage. A found location can create as many questions as it answers when people believe the place had been checked. You can see detectives reviewing who searched whether visibility was poor, whether vegetation was different months later, and whether the record of the search matched the memory of it. These are careful questions, not sensational ones. Searches are made by people, and people get tired. They step around obstacles. They focus on what seems most likely. They may pass near something without seeing it, especially in rough country where the eye is asked to process too much. This does not make their effort careless. It makes their effort human. The Bennington file is full of human effort meeting human limits. As the years passed, each disappearance settled into a different kind of silence. Some had no recovery. One had partial recovery without full explanation. All remained difficult. The combined story became stronger in public memory than any official resolution. You can hear how that happens. People remember patterns because patterns help them carry what cannot be solved. A pattern gives the mind a handle. But detectives need more than a handle. They need a path from fact to fact. In the Bennington case, those paths often ended in fog. A sighting could not be extended. A scent trail could not be confirmed. A bus memory could not become a location. A search map could not prove what had been missed. The investigation kept finding edges instead of doors. This is why a quiet retelling may be the most honest one. It allows the case to remain difficult without forcing it to become theatrical. We can let the old offices be old offices, the roads be roads, the trail be a trail, and the people be people. There is enough in that. The mystery does not need to be enlarged beyond its true shape. You turn now toward the way detectives think when a case has gone cold. First they ask what is certain. Then they ask what only seems certain because it has been repeated. Then they ask what was never checked or what could not be checked at the time. The process is slow, almost meditative. It is a kind of cleaning, a careful dusting of each shelf in the room of the file. For the Bennington case, certainty begins with last known circumstances. Rivers was with a hunting party near mountain country. Welden left the college and was seen heading toward the long trail. Tedford was returning by bus to Bennington. Jepson disappeared near his family area. Langer turned back toward camp during a walk. Each statement is useful, but each one stops just before the part we need most. The next layer is reported detail: clothing, weather, witnesses, possible scent trails, belongings, search routes, later discoveries. These details carry different weights. Some come from official reports, some come from newspapers, some come from later books or local recollection. A patient investigator separates them, because the source of a detail matters almost as much as the detail itself. You can picture little piles forming on the desk: confirmed, reported, unclear, later retelling, needs checking. The labels are quiet, but they change everything. A case can look more mysterious when all details are treated as equal. It can also look falsely simple if uncertain details are thrown away too quickly. We keep the piles open, with room to move a paper if better information appears. The Bennington case has lived for so long in that middle space that the middle space has become part of its identity. People ask why detectives could not crack it, and one answer is that the available facts did not form a strong enough structure. You cannot climb a staircase made of mist. You can only note where the steps might have been, and keep looking for wood beneath your feet. That phrase may sound gentle, but the work behind it is very practical. Re-interview surviving witnesses, if any remain. Compare old maps to modern ones. Check whether roads have moved, trails changed, buildings vanished. Review newspaper accounts for contradictions. Search archives for overlooked reports. Consider whether any unidentified remains found elsewhere could connect. Each task is slow, and most produce nothing final. Still, the task matters. Cold case work is often a practice of respect. It says the passage of time does not erase the duty to look. It says an old question can still deserve a fresh reading. When you sit with the Bennington file tonight, you are participating in that kind of respect, even if only in imagination, with your hands resting near the paper and your breathing slowed. There is a softness in old archives that suits this kind of reflection. The air is cool and dry. Boxes sit in rows. Labels fade slightly at the edges. A fluorescent light may hum above, or perhaps there is only the warm circle of our imagined lamp. When you open a box, there is a faint smell of cardboard and dust, and for a moment the years feel close enough to touch. Inside the box, the Bennington case does not speak in one voice. It speaks in official notes, newspaper lines, family memories, local stories, and later attempts to make sense of the whole. Some voices are steady, some tremble, some are too confident. The detective's work is to listen without being carried away. Our work tonight is similar, only quieter. You may notice how often the case returns to movement, walking ahead, walking toward a trail, riding a bus, playing or waiting near work, returning to camp. These are ordinary transitions, the spaces between one safe point and another. The Bennington mystery lives in those spaces. It asks what can happen between places when no one is watching closely enough to preserve the answer. That thought can feel unsettling, so we hold it gently. Every life is full of unnoticed transitions. Most end exactly as expected. A person reaches home, finds dry clothes, steps off the bus, returns to the group, answers when called. The Bennington case remains in memory because several transitions did not end that way, and because detectives could not show why. The ordinary world briefly failed to complete its sentence. Investigators are trained, in their way, to finish sentences. They look for cause, root, motive, opportunity, accident, witness, and trace. They look for grammar in events, but sometimes the evidence gives only a fragment. The subject is known, the verb begins, and then the page tears. You can sit for years with a torn page, hoping another piece will be found in a drawer. In Bennington, no such piece was large enough. Some clues may have existed and been lost to weather. Some may have been seen and not recognized. Some may never have existed in recoverable form. A disappearance can occur without leaving a neat trail. That is one of the hardest truths in old missing person work, and it is one detectives know too well. The quiet heroism in these cases is not certainty, it is return. Searchers return to ground, families return to memory, detectives return to files, writers and local historians return to the names, sometimes imperfectly, but often with care. You return tonight as a listener, opening the case again in the dark, not to force it awake, but to keep company with the unanswered. When you think of Bennington itself, try to let it be more than a mystery setting. It is a real Vermont town with seasons, porches, classrooms, shops, snowbanks, summer insects, church bells, and ordinary dinner tables. The case passed through that living place. It did not replace it. That distinction matters because a community is never only the worst or strangest thing remembered about it. People there would have known the roads by feel. They would have known which hill iced first, which path stayed muddy, which neighbor owned which field, and where the bus usually stopped. That local knowledge helped searches, but it also may have created assumptions. Familiarity can guide you well, and sometimes it can make the unlikely harder to see. Detectives have to account for both. The old roads near Bennington carried more than cars. They carried habits. A person seen walking might not seem remarkable. A bus passenger resting with his head near a window might not draw concern. A child near a farmyard might be assumed to be close by. A woman returning to change clothes might seem to need only a few minutes. Many mysteries begin in moments that looked normal while they were happening. That is why early recognition matters so much. The sooner a moment is understood as important, the more carefully it can be preserved. But no one can live every ordinary minute as if it will become evidence. Life would be impossible that way. The Bennington case reveals that painful mismatch between how life is lived and how investigations later need life to have been recorded. You can feel the mismatch in the witness statements. A person says they think it was late afternoon. They believe the coat was red. They remember a face, but not the exact time. They remember a bus stop, but not who got off. These are not failures of character. They are the normal limits of attention. Detectives had to build from them anyway. In the Paula Welden search, public attention brought many eyes, but many eyes do not always create clarity. Some may see what others miss. Some may report what does not belong. Some may unintentionally shape their memory after hearing details from elsewhere. You can imagine investigators pinning down each account, asking the same calm questions while the telephone line crackles faintly in the receiver. For James Tedford, the enclosed bus should have narrowed the possibilities, and yet the record still opened outward. That is one of the reasons his case remains so peculiar within the Bennington group. Public transportation creates a schedule, but schedules do not observe everything. A bus has windows, doors, stops, passengers, distractions, and moments when attention turns away. The system is orderly, but the human experience inside it is not. For Paul Jepson, the world was small until it was not. A farm area, a child, a parent working, a gap in sight. Searchers may have known him, or known the family, or known the land. That closeness can make a search more urgent and more painful. You hear it in the imagined voices calling his name, and in the silence after each call. For Frieda, the eventual discovery complicated the memory of the search. It reminded investigators that even extensive work can fail to locate what is later found. The land may hide, but so may assumptions. Searchers may believe a place has been cleared when only parts of it have been walked. Weather may change visibility. Snow may cover and uncover. Time alters the scene while everyone is still trying to understand it. For Middie Rivers, the question remains almost elemental. How does a guide vanish from country he knows? The answer may be ordinary and unknowable. It may involve accident, illness, misdirection, or terrain. But without recovery, without a clear trace, the file cannot choose. You sit with that humility, because the woods sometimes leave no explanation small enough for paper. The Bennington case is made of these separate humilities. The humility to admit a search can miss. The humility to admit a witness can err. The humility to admit a pattern may be coincidence. The humility to admit coincidence may still feel meaningful. Detectives live inside those tensions. Tonight, we let them loosen rather than tighten, because sleep asks for open hands. As the night in our imagined office deepens, you might notice the sounds becoming smaller. The pages turn more slowly. The rain, if there is rain, softens against the glass. The lamp throws a warm edge along the map of Vermont. The Bennington file remains open, but it is no longer asking you to hurry through it. It has waited for many years. It can wait a little longer. There is one more aspect of the investigation we should hold before moving deeper, and it has to do with how time changes not only evidence, but the people who carry it. A witness who was young in 1946 becomes older. A searcher retires. A detective's notes outlive the detective. A child who heard adults whisper about Paula Welden grows into someone who remembers the whisper more clearly than the source. This is how memory becomes layered. First there is the event, then there is the telling of the event, then there is the memory of the telling. By the time a cold case investigator returns decades later, the layers may be pressed together like old leaves in a book. You can separate them only with patience, and sometimes not completely. The Bennington case has had many tellers: newspapers, local historians, mystery writers, residents, researchers, and curious outsiders have all shaped its public form. Some focused on the unexplained atmosphere, some focused on policing failures, some focused on geography, some tried to connect every disappearance tightly. Others warned that the connections were weaker than legend suggested. A detective has to listen past all of that. You and I, sitting here quietly, can do the same. We can let the legends remain at the edge of the room, where they belong, while we keep the file under the lamp. The smell of paper is steadier than rumor. The map is steadier than mood. The names are steadier than the phrase that later gathered them together. That steadiness is our guide. When a case becomes famous, the unsolved part can overshadow the investigative work already done. People ask why no one found the answer, as if the answer must have been waiting in plain sight. But in Bennington, people did search. People did ask. People did organize. People did care. The failure to solve does not mean the absence of effort. It means effort met conditions it could not overcome. Those conditions were different in each disappearance, yet they shared certain features. Limited last sightings, difficult or ordinary environments that left few traces, search areas that expanded quickly, communication that moved at the speed of the era, public pressure, emotional strain, later retellings that blurred fact and interpretation. Together, those conditions form the wall detectives kept encountering. You can place your palm on that wall tonight, not to push through it, but to feel its texture. It is not smooth. It is made of bark, paper, cold glass, bus upholstery, farm dust, trail mud, and the worn edge of a photograph. It is made of human uncertainty. That is why it has lasted. Not because it is magical, but because it is made from the hardest materials an investigator knows. The photographs, if we imagine them spread carefully on the desk, would not be dramatic. A portrait, a road, a wooded slope, perhaps a clipping with a grainy image. The paper might curl slightly at the corner. The faces would carry the ordinary dignity of people who did not ask to become part of a mystery. You look at them, and the room grows quieter. A good detective never forgets that a photograph is not a clue only. It is also a person being held still by light. Paula Welden was more than the red coat and the trail. Paul Jepson was more than the farmyard and the search. James Tedford was more than the bus seat. Middie Rivers was more than the mountain. Frieda was more than the place where she was found. That is why tonight's rhythm stays slow. Speed would flatten them. Sensation would use them. We are doing something else. We are reading carefully, with compassion, noticing how the investigation worked and where it could not reach. The Bennington case deserves that slower room, where no one is turned into a clue too quickly. When detectives reviewed the possible explanations, they would have had to consider accidental misadventure. This is the plainest possibility for several parts of the case, and perhaps the most difficult to prove without recovery. Woods, weather, water, injury, and exposure can create disappearances that look baffling afterward. You do not need to add anything dramatic for a person to be lost beyond finding. They also would have considered voluntary disappearance, especially in the case of an adult who left a known setting. But voluntary disappearance leaves its own questions. Money, planning, later sightings, communication, motive, and destination all matter. With Paula Welden, speculation about leaving by choice existed, but no confirmed later life emerged to settle it. The idea remained possible to some, unproved to all. They would have considered foul play, because detectives must consider it when someone disappears without explanation. But foul play also requires evidence, if it is to become more than a fear. A suspect, an opportunity, a witness, a physical trace, a confession consistent with facts, some point where the theory touches the ground. In the Bennington case, such grounding did not arrive in a way that solved the cases. For Tedford, confusion or medical distress might have been considered. For Paul, wandering or abduction would both have had to be weighed. For Rivers and Langer, terrain and accident would naturally stand close to the front of the file. Yet each person resists being absorbed into one shared theory. That resistance is part of the answer to the title's question, and it has the quiet stubbornness of fact. You can imagine the detectives returning again and again to chronology. 1945, 1946, 1949, 1950. The sequence looks close enough to invite connection, spread enough to frustrate it, and varied enough to resist a single explanation. A pattern with no mechanism is only a shape. Detectives needed a mechanism, and the file did not provide one. A mechanism would mean something that makes the cases work together. The same person seen near multiple disappearances, the same vehicle, the same method of approach, the same location beyond broad geography, the same recovered trace. Without that, connection remains an idea rather than an investigative conclusion. You can feel how careful the wording has to be. The Bennington area itself became the mechanism in popular memory. But land is not motive. A region can make disappearances harder to solve without causing them in one unified way. Mountain country can hide an accident. Rural roads can limit witnesses. Weather can erase signs. Sparse records can weaken later review. All of that matters, and none of it proves a single hidden story. This is where the calm detective beside us might remove his glasses, rub the bridge of his nose, and look again at the map. Not in despair, exactly. More in recognition. The file has been honest. It has shown what it has. It has also shown what it lacks. And what it lacks is the bridge between disappearance and explanation. You may hear the radiator clicking in that old office again. The sound is small and regular. A car passes outside on wet pavement. Somewhere in another room, a drawer shuts. The Bennington case lies open, and the detective writes a note in the margin, perhaps only a question mark beside a witness statement that has never felt entirely settled. Question marks are not failures. They are markers of honesty. They tell the next reader where the ground is soft. They prevent false closure. In cold case work, a good question mark can be more useful than a confident mistake. You can leave one there and return years later, still knowing exactly where uncertainty lived. The question marks in the Bennington case are many. Was Rivers closer to the group than later memory suggests? Did Paula continue up the trail, accept a ride, turn aside, or meet someone? Was Tedford definitely present near the end of the bus route? Did Paul reach the road? How did Frieda come to be found where she was found? Each question opens carefully, without an easy answer. As we move through them, the script of the night stays even. There is no need to quicken. The old cases have already waited longer than any of us. Our task is to read, breathe, and understand the patience of those who tried before. The Bennington file does not reward urgency. It rewards attention, and attention can be soft. Across the decades, attention often comes in waves. An anniversary arrives. A book mentions the case. A local article revisits the disappearances. Someone hears the phrase Bennington Triangle and looks deeper. New curiosity gathers around old facts. Then the wave passes, and the file returns to quiet. But quiet is not the same as forgetting. It is simply the state in which cold cases spend most of their lives. In that quiet, records matter. The survival of a note, a map, a clipping, or a search report can determine what later generations are able to ask. If something was never written down, it may be gone. If something was written vaguely, it may remain vague forever. Detectives in old cases often find themselves investigating the investigation itself, trying to learn not only what happened, but what was documented about what happened. You can feel that secondary investigation in the Bennington case, which details come from contemporary reports, which come from later summaries, which were repeated because they were true, and which because they were memorable. The work is slow and almost archival. It has the smell of pencil dust, old newsprint, and a room kept cooler than comfort for the sake of paper. That archival work is patient detective work too. It may not involve walking a trail. It may involve sitting very still with 3 versions of the same event, noting where they differ. One says late afternoon, another says near dusk. One mentions a coat, another omits it. One names a road, another uses a broader place name. The differences may mean little, or they may matter. In Paula Welden's case, for example, small differences in timing could affect how far she might have walked before dark. In Tedford's case, small differences in where he was last noticed could affect whether he could have left the bus unseen. In Frieda's case, small differences in search location could affect how strange the later discovery appears. The file is made of these delicate hinges. You turn them gently. You do not force them. A hinge can break if you demand too much from it. Better to oil it with patience, move it a little, and accept what it can and cannot reveal. That is the bedtime pace of the Bennington case tonight. Steady enough for thought, soft enough for sleep. The wider world around these cases was changing. The years after the Second World War carried their own moods, with people returning, institutions shifting, communities adjusting, and travel becoming ordinary in new ways. Yet rural investigations still had older rhythms. News traveled by paper, radio, telephone, and conversation. A missing person notice depended on human distribution. A lead might arrive folded in an envelope or spoken across a counter. You can imagine a clerk remembering someone only after seeing a photograph. You can imagine a driver trying to place a face among many faces. You can imagine a student at Bennington College replaying a brief hallway conversation with Paula, wondering whether it meant anything. Most memories would lead nowhere, but each had to be treated carefully at first. That is the labor hidden beneath a single line saying authorities investigated. Authorities investigated can mean hundreds of small acts. It can mean muddy shoes by a station door, maps covered in pencil marks, long-distance calls, letters sent, relatives interviewed, and officers standing beside roads in cold weather. It can mean hope rising with a reported sighting, then lowering again when the sighting fails. The phrase is brief because official language has to be brief. The work was not. In the Bennington case, those small acts did not gather into closure. They gathered into history. The difference is important. Closure would have meant answers for families and clear explanations for records. History meant the events remained, were retold, were reconsidered, and became part of how people understood the place. The file continued to breathe, but only quietly. The land has its own archive too, though it is harder to read. Old paths sink under leaves. Foundations remain as low stones. A road that once carried wagons becomes a line through trees. A clearing grows over. If you walked near Glastonbury years later, you might feel the past underfoot without knowing what belonged to which year. Detectives cannot subpoena that kind of memory. They can only study it indirectly. That is another reason the Bennington case resists certainty. Places change while seeming to remain themselves. A search area, described in 1950, may look different a decade later, and different again after another generation. Trees grow, water shifts, trails are rerouted, human landmarks vanish. Later researchers may stand in the right general place and still not see the world the searchers saw. You hold that thought beside the map. The map is not the territory, and the territory is not fixed. A line printed in ink cannot show the depth of wet leaves, the height of brush, the way fog sits in a hollow, or how quickly dusk comes behind a ridge. We need maps, but we also need humility before them. The Bennington detectives needed both. There is a quiet tenderness in imagining those early search maps. They were tools, but they were also records of care. Each marked area meant someone went there because a missing person mattered. Each checked field or trail meant a little more effort placed against uncertainty. Even when the map failed to produce an answer, it preserved the fact that people tried. When a case remains unsolved, later readers sometimes look for the mistake. Surely someone missed the decisive clue. Surely the answer was mishandled. Sometimes that is true, mistakes happen. But sometimes the decisive clue was never visible, or never existed in a durable form. The Bennington case may contain mistakes, as any human effort can, but its difficulty cannot be reduced only to error. The more honest view is quieter. Detectives faced multiple disappearances with thin evidence, difficult terrain, limited technology, imperfect witness memory, and growing public legend. They worked inside those limits. The limits did not move enough. That is not a satisfying answer for a mystery audience, but it may be the truest answer available under the lamp tonight. You can feel the file settling as we reach this understanding, not closing, but settling. The pages still hold unanswered names. The map still shows roads leading into trees. The questions still lean toward one another, but the shape of the problem has become clearer. Detectives could not crack the Bennington case because the case was not one clean lock, and because the keys, if there were keys, were scattered across time, weather, and memory. Now we come back to the people who kept the questions alive, because a cold case survives only when someone continues to care. Families care first, and most deeply, then local officers, reporters, historians, archivists, and sometimes strangers carry smaller pieces of that care. You are carrying one tonight, lightly, as you listen from the edge of sleep. A family member might save a clipping in a drawer. A detective might keep a note after retirement. A resident might remember where searchers parked their cars. A college archive might preserve a mention of Paula Welden that later readers can still find. These small acts do not solve the case, but they prevent total disappearance. They keep the missing from vanishing a second time. The Bennington case, for all its uncertainty, has not been forgotten. That matters. Forgetting is easy when records are thin and years are many. Remembering requires repetition, and repetition requires care if it is not to become distortion. Tonight we are choosing the careful kind of repetition, the one that says the names slowly and leaves room around them. There is Middie Rivers, familiar with the woods and still lost to them. There is Paula Welden, walking from campus toward a trail in early winter. There is James Tedford, returning by bus and not arriving in any way the record could explain. There is Paul Jepson, a child in an October landscape. There is Frieda Langer, turning back toward camp, and later found without the full story becoming clear. The list is not a drumbeat, it is a row of candles. Each one gives a little light, and none explains the others completely. You can sit beside them, without forcing them into one flame. The Bennington case is difficult, partly because respect requires that separation. To honor the people inside it, we cannot let the pattern erase the person. Detectives know this in practice. A theory that explains a pattern too neatly may fail one individual fact. A theory that fits one disappearance may not fit the others. A theory that feels emotionally satisfying may have no evidence beneath it. The patient investigator keeps testing, not because doubt is pleasant, but because care demands it. That testing can last years. It can continue after the original detectives are gone. It can be taken up by someone who never met the missing, never saw the first search, and never heard the first fear in the family's voices. Still, the file can communicate its weight. You open it, and the weight transfers quietly into your hands. The paper has a particular sound when you close it partway and open it again. A soft scrape, a hinge of cardboard, the whisper of thin pages. In that sound you can hear the life of a cold case, closed but not finished, stored but not forgotten, quiet but capable of being read again. The Bennington file has made that sound many times. And when the next box comes down from the shelf, we begin to notice how the official record and the public legend moved side by side, sometimes touching, sometimes drifting apart, while the detectives stayed with the harder task of asking what could actually be known. And when the next box comes down from the shelf, we begin to notice how the official record and the public legend moved side by side, sometimes touching, sometimes drifting apart, while the detectives stayed with the harder task of asking what could actually be known. You can feel the difference as soon as the papers are spread out before you. The official pages are dry and careful, while the clippings are louder in their phrasing, even when their ink has faded to a soft gray. A newspaper has to tell a story quickly. A police file has to preserve a fact slowly. That difference matters in the Bennington case, because much of what later listeners remember came through public retellings, local talk, and the natural human need to give shape to uncertainty. You and I can read both kinds of record, but we hold them at different distances, the way a detective would. On one side of the desk, there are names, dates, routes, and searches. On the other, there are phrases that gather atmosphere, mystery, and sometimes exaggeration. The phrase Bennington Triangle belongs more to the second pile than the first, though it points toward real disappearances. You can let it remain useful as a doorway, without letting it decide what the room contains. Official records tend to be modest. They do not usually say the mountain felt strange, or the town seemed haunted, or the road held a secret. They say a person was last seen. A search was conducted. No trace was found, and the investigation continued. That plainness can feel unsatisfying at first, but it is also a form of honesty. It leaves space for what is known and what is not. The public legend, by contrast, often wants the disappearances to speak to one another. It places rivers, Welden, Tedford, Jepson, and Langer into a single murmuring line. It notices the dates, the geography, the unanswered endings. It may be sincere, and it may preserve memory, but it can also smooth away important differences. You notice that smoothing as you read, and you quietly restore the rough edges. Those rough edges are where detective work lives. A polished legend can make the Bennington case feel like one strange force moving through the Green Mountains. A rough file reminds you that one person was on a hunting trip, another was walking from college, another was on a bus, another was a child near home, and another was returning to change wet clothing. The difference is everything. If you were reviewing the case as an investigator, you would begin by asking which details are contemporary. That means details recorded close to the time, before years of retelling could shape them. You would mark newspaper articles from the relevant week, police notes, search reports, and direct witness statements. Then you would set later accounts beside them, not rejecting them automatically, but treating them with care. The room around you becomes very quiet during that work. The lamp throws a warm circle on the desk. A pencil rests beside your hand. The air smells faintly of paper fibers, dust, and the dry cardboard of storage boxes. You turn one clipping over and find a date printed on the back. Even the reverse side of a page can matter. This is the kind of patience the Bennington case demands. It is not the patience of simply waiting for answers to arrive. It is the patience of sorting language, checking origin, and asking whether a detail has been repeated because it was verified or because it was memorable. You learn to move slowly through sentences. You learn to mistrust your own desire for a perfect pattern. Desire is not a flaw. Exactly. Everyone wants a pattern when people vanish. Families want it because a pattern might lead to a person. Detectives want it because a pattern might become a lead. Communities want it because a pattern makes fear feel less random. But wanting is not finding. and in Bennington, finding remained the harder thing. The old police methods were built around proximity. Officers went to places, spoke to people, looked at ground, checked buildings, and asked practical questions. They had no central database humming in the background, no instant digital search across states, no automatic way to see whether another jurisdiction had something that matched. You can feel the slower pace in every step. It was not careless. It was simply the age it belonged to. A lead might travel by telephone, letter, telegram, or car. If someone thought they saw Paula Welden in another town, that report had to be relayed, assessed, and followed up by people with limited time and uncertain information. If someone thought Tedford had left the bus earlier than reported, someone had to find and question passengers. If someone mentioned a strange car near a road, the car had to become more than a passing description before it could help. You sit with those limitations, and the Bennington case becomes less like a riddle and more like a difficult piece of history. The searchers were working with tools that feel almost quiet now. Paper, voice, memory, footprints, if weather spared them, dogs, if scent remained, aircraft, if visibility and resources allowed, human bodies moving through the cold, one careful step after another. Dogs appear in several old missing person searches, and it is easy to imagine them as certainty on four legs. But scent work has its own limitations. Weather, contamination, time, terrain, and the availability of a reliable scent article can all affect what happens. A dog may give a direction that matters, or one that cannot later be confirmed. You can note it in the file without turning it into proof. In Paul Jepson's case, the reported scent toward a road has often drawn attention. If true and reliable, it might suggest movement away from the immediate farm area, but a direction is not a destination, and a road is not an answer. Detectives would still need to know whether a vehicle stopped, whether anyone saw him, whether the scent trail was fresh, and whether the account itself had remained stable over time. This is how every promising detail in the Bennington case becomes both important and insufficient. Paula's last sightings matter, but they do not reveal what happened afterward. Tedford's belongings matter, but they do not explain his absence. Frieda's later discovery matters, but it does not reconstruct her final route. Rivers's knowledge of the woods matters, but it does not prevent accident or misfortune. Each clue holds weight, then stops. A patient detective learns not to resent that stopping point. He simply marks it. The line goes this far. The ground is firm until here. After that, it softens. You can imagine a margin note in careful handwriting, not dramatic, only honest. Needs confirmation. Source uncertain. Search area unclear. Passenger statements incomplete. These phrases are small lamps in the file. The Bennington investigation also had to contend with weather as an active eraser. Rain can blur impressions in soil. Snow can hide objects and then move them. Wind can scatter leaves over disturbed ground. Cold can change how long searches remain effective. Fog can shrink visibility until a person 20 paces away feels absent. The mountains do not need mystery to make searches difficult. They have weather. You can smell it in the pages if you let yourself imagine deeply enough. Wet wool hung near a stove. Leather boots darkened by mud. Pine needles crushed underfoot. The metallic chill of a thermos cup, damp paper maps protected under coats. These are the textures of a search before modern convenience, and they belong to the Bennington case as surely as any famous theory. By the time a person is missing overnight, the emotional world changes too. Searchers become more tired. Families become more afraid. Officials become more pressured. Reporters arrive. Rumors begin moving faster. The first clean lines of the investigation acquire fingerprints from everyone who touches them. This does not mean the work is ruined. It means the work becomes more difficult. You can sense that difficulty around Paula Welden. Her disappearance involved a college, a family, local authorities, state-level concern, and public interest beyond the town. Each circle had its own urgency and its own perspective. The college community wanted to know what had happened to one of its students. Her family wanted action and answers. Police wanted reliable facts. Newspapers wanted developments. The file had to hold all of that noise. Yet the last known image remained quiet. A young woman walking. A road. A trail. Early winter light. The simplicity of that image may be why it has endured. You can see it without strain, and because you can see it, you almost believe the next moment should be visible too. But the next moment is precisely where the record fails. The Bennington case asks us to respect that failure without decorating it too much. There may have been a turn, a conversation, a ride, a misstep, a decision, or an accident. There may have been something no one saw. Detectives could imagine each possibility, but imagination could not choose among them. That is the discipline we keep returning to, softly, like a hand resting on the file. James Tedford's disappearance asks for another kind of discipline, because the circumstances tempt the mind toward impossibility. A man on a bus is there, then not there. Belongings remain. The schedule continues. The story feels as if it has skipped a frame. But detectives cannot investigate a skipped frame. They have to slow the film down and ask whether the frame was ever as clear as it seemed. Was he seen at the last stop? By whom? How certain was that person? Was the bus crowded? Did anyone sleep? Could he have left during a stop and not been noticed? Were his belongings definitely his? And were they definitely found where later accounts say? These questions do not dissolve the strangeness, but they make it workable. You can hear the investigator breathing more evenly as the questions become precise. Precision is calming in cold cases. It does not always solve them, but it prevents them from becoming shapeless. The Bennington case, especially in its public form, can become a mist if you let every retelling flow together. Precision gives it banks. It says, here is the river, here is the shore, here is where we cannot cross. For sleep, that kind of careful boundary is a comfort. The field searches for Paul Jepson and Frieda had different emotional temperatures. Paul's involved a child, and that changes every searcher's heart. Frieda's involved an adult walker in rough country, and then the later discovery brought a heavy, incomplete confirmation. Yet both show how land can resist the simplest questions. Where did the person go? How far? By what route? Under whose observation? The land answered only partly. In Paul's case, the questions would have narrowed around minutes. In Frieda's, they may have widened around terrain. A few minutes near a farm can be as challenging as a mile in the woods if no one sees the decisive movement. You can place those two problems side by side and feel how different they are. Both defeat easy certainty. Both belong to the Bennington file. The investigators had to decide where to spend effort. Every search has boundaries, even when people wish it did not. Daylight ends. Volunteers tire. Roads have to be covered. Leads come in. Dogs need handlers. Aircraft need conditions. A command structure has to decide which direction is most likely. And those decisions later become part of what people question. You can feel the weight of making them without knowing the answer. A search area is not just a circle drawn on a map. It is a set of assumptions. How fast could the person move? Was the person injured? Did they know the land? Were they trying to be found? Were they trying not to be found? Did they accept help? Did they leave the area entirely? Each assumption changes the circle, and in the Bennington case, the assumptions were often uncertain from the start. You could spend a whole quiet hour with just one of those assumptions. Paula may have intended only a walk, or she may have intended more. Rivers may have stayed close to the hunting party, or he may have moved farther than expected. Tedford may have remained on the bus near Bennington, or he may have left earlier. The words may have matter because the file cannot show us beyond them. This is why detectives often return to timelines. Time is the frame around possibility. If Paula was seen at one place at 1 hour, then certain routes become possible and others less so. If Tedford was seen after one stop, that narrows the window. If Paul was out of sight for only a short span, that shapes the search. If Frieda turned back at a certain point, that defines expected ground. But timelines in old cases are rarely perfect. Clocks differ. Witnesses estimate. People remember a sequence, but not an hour. Newspaper accounts may compress events. Official notes may omit context. You read the timeline, then read around it, feeling for loose boards beneath your feet. The Bennington case has many such boards, and none can bear too much weight alone. The role of newspapers deserves another careful look. They preserve details that might otherwise have vanished, but they also shaped public understanding while events were still unfolding. A headline can make uncertainty sound sharper. A repeated phrase can become part of memory. A missing detail can make later readers think something was never known, when perhaps it was simply not printed. You hold clippings respectfully, but not blindly. In the quiet of the archive, newsprint has a particular smell. It is dry, slightly sweet, and dusty, like old wood and ink. Your fingers may darken faintly after turning several pages. The columns are narrow. The type is small. Names appear beside advertisements and weather notes, reminding you that these disappearances happened inside ordinary days, not in a separate world made only of mystery. That ordinariness is one of the most important things to preserve. Paula's college world had meals, assignments, friendships, and small private worries. Tedford's bus route had stops and fares and passengers thinking of their own errands. Paul's farm had chores. Frieda's outing had practical concerns. Rivers's hunting party had the familiar rhythms of men moving through known woods. The Bennington case begins in ordinary life each time. Because of that, investigators had to look for the moment ordinary life stopped behaving predictably. That moment is often tiny. A turn taken, a delay, a missed connection, a decision not mentioned to anyone because it seemed unimportant. You can see why those moments are so hard to recover after the fact. They are the very moments people do not think to record. The Bennington case also illustrates how absence can be misleading. When there is no trace, people sometimes imagine a deliberate erasure. Sometimes that may be possible. But absence can also come from weather, terrain, animal activity, poor preservation, limited searching, or simply the vastness of unobserved space. A lack of evidence does not point in one direction by itself. It asks for caution. Caution is not the same as dullness. It is a kind of care. Tonight, as we read, caution keeps the room peaceful. We do not need the case to become stranger than it was. We let it be hard because hard is enough. We let it be sad because sadness is already present. We let it remain unfinished because unfinished is the shape the record has kept. At times, the Bennington mystery has been pulled towards supernatural or highly speculative explanations, especially because the phrase Bennington Triangle invites that kind of imagination. But detectives did not have that luxury. They had to remain with roads, trails, people, weather, and evidence. You and I remain there too, not because the human imagination is unwelcome, but because the people in the file deserve a grounded reading. A grounded reading still allows atmosphere. It simply does not mistake atmosphere for proof. The dark line of a mountain can feel watchful without watching. An abandoned town can feel lonely without causing harm. A foggy road can feel secretive, while being only a foggy road. The Bennington case lives in a place that invites mood, but the investigation had to live in fact. Fact, in these files, sometimes means saying very little. Last seen walking. Failed to return. Search conducted. No result. It can feel almost too spare for the lives it describes. Yet those spare lines were the firm stones detectives could step on. Around them was water, You can move only from stone to stone, even when you wish for a bridge. One of the hardest parts of reviewing the Bennington case is accepting that some questions may have been answerable only briefly. A footprint might have existed before rain. A witness might have noticed a vehicle but forgotten it before anyone asked. A passenger might have seen Tedford stand up, then dismissed it as ordinary. A child might have left a track that searchers crossed too late. Time can close a door before anyone sees the door. That thought returns us to the first hours after each disappearance. First hours are delicate. They are full of possibility, but also confusion. People do not yet know which detail matters. A family may think someone is delayed. A friend may assume a plan changed. A driver may not notice one passenger among many. By the time alarm hardens into certainty, the world has already moved. Detectives in the Bennington case often entered after that movement had begun. They could reconstruct, but not pause. They could interview, but not preserve the original moment. They could search, but not restore the first footprint. This is the quiet tragedy of many cold cases. Investigation begins with a disadvantage, and the disadvantage grows with every hour. Still, they searched. We should keep saying that gently. They did not simply shrug at the mountains. They walked, called, questioned, organized, and tried to make the available world yield information. The Bennington file is not a record of indifference. It is a record of effort, under conditions that did not return the effort with answers. Imagine a search headquarters, temporary and busy, with maps on a table and people coming in from outside. Coats steam faintly near a stove. Someone pours coffee. Someone reports that a section has been covered. Someone else mentions a possible sighting that needs checking. Voices are low, tired, and purposeful. No one knows which small report might matter, so each one receives its moment. This practical atmosphere may be less famous than the legends, but it is more meaningful. It shows people responding to absence with labor. It shows a community trying to narrow the unknown. It shows the patient, repetitive side of detective work, the side that keeps going after the first wave of alarm has passed. For the Bennington case, that side is essential. When a search ends without success, the work does not truly stop. It changes form. The physical search becomes a paper search. The field becomes a file. Instead of walking ground, detectives walk statements. Instead of calling into woods, they call witnesses. Instead of looking under branches, they look between lines. You can feel that shift as the pages thicken and the mud dries on everyone's boots. The file stage can last much longer than the search stage. It can last a lifetime. An officer may think of the case while driving past a certain road. A family member may reread a clipping every December. A college may mention Paula's name in an archive, and a researcher may pause there decades later. The Bennington case lived in these returns, not in one continuous investigation, but in repeated acts of remembering. Repeated remembering has to be tended, like a garden in shade. Too little, and the names disappear. Too much uncontrolled growth, and rumor covers the original paths. The careful teller prunes lightly. The careful detective checks sources. Tonight, we are doing both in a soft way, keeping the path visible without cutting the whole forest down. The differences among the cases also become more important the longer you sit with them. Rivers and Langer had direct connections to wooded or mountain terrain. Welden may have entered that terrain, but was first moving through a college and road environment. Jepson began near a farm, and Tedford inside public transportation. A single explanation has to stretch awkwardly across those settings. That awkwardness matters. If the cases were unrelated, then the Bennington mystery is partly a story about clustering in memory. Human beings notice when several unresolved events occur near one place within a handful of years. We make a container for them. The container becomes a name. The name becomes a story. The story becomes famous. Detectives, however, still have to ask whether the container reflects evidence or only memory's need for order. If the cases were related in some hidden way, then the connecting evidence either was not found, was not recognized, or did not survive. That possibility cannot be entirely dismissed from a distance, but it also cannot be claimed without proof. You can see the difficulty. Both pathways remain open enough to be considered, but neither becomes strong enough to close the file. The Bennington case stayed between those pathways. That in-between quality is why it has endured. It is not solved by saying the cases are certainly connected. It is not solved by saying they are certainly not. The truth may lie among accidents, misreadings, isolated events, and perhaps some unknown human action, all mixed together in ways the record can no longer separate. A detective's work is often to separate rumor from report, separate fear from fact, separate coincidence from pattern, separate possibility from probability, separate what is known from what is wished. In the Bennington file, every separation leaves another tangled thread beneath it. You pull gently, and the knot tightens unless you stop in time. So you stop. You breathe. You let the paper rest. This too is part of patient investigation. Knowing when not to pull harder. Knowing when the evidence has given all it can for the night. In our quiet study, that restraint keeps the old case from becoming distorted under the pressure of our curiosity. There is another kind of evidence we should mention, though it is difficult to handle. It is the evidence of institutional change. After Paula Welden's disappearance, criticism of the response contributed to support for a stronger state police structure in Vermont. The details of that change belong to public history, but for our purposes the meaning is simple. An unsolved case can reveal the need for better systems. Better systems do not solve the original case retroactively. They cannot bring back lost time or recover evidence that weather has taken. But they can shape later responses. They can create clearer authority, broader coordination, and more consistent procedures. You can feel how practical that lesson is, and how sad. It is a lantern lit too late for the first traveler, but perhaps in time for someone else. The Bennington case, therefore, sits at the edge of investigative history, as well as local mystery. It shows an older world of fragmented response giving way, slowly, to more organized policing. It reminds us that procedure matters. Who leads? Who coordinates? Who preserves records? Who communicates with family? Who checks distant leads? These questions are not abstractions. When a person is missing, you can imagine Paula's father pressing for answers, not as a character in a legend, but as a parent facing the unbearable thinness of uncertainty. His concern had force, because the case had force. The file, in that sense, moved outward into law and policy. Even unresolved, it altered the world around it. That is one of the quietest forms of consequence. For detectives, family pressure can be difficult, but it is also understandable. Families live with stakes that no official can fully share. They may push, question, doubt, and demand, because love does not accept procedural patience as easily as a file does. A good investigator hears the pain beneath the pressure. In the Bennington case, that human tension belongs in the room too. You sit with it softly, a family waiting near a telephone, a college community searching notice boards for updates, a veteran's home expecting a man to return, a farm suddenly filled with searchers, a hiking companion replaying the moment Frieda turned back. None of these scenes needs heightening. They are already full of feeling, and the feeling is quiet enough for nighttime, because it is handled with respect. The case also reminds us how names remain when answers do not. Names are anchors. Middie Rivers, Paula Jean Welden, James Tedford, Paul Jepson, Frieda Langer. Each name steadies the story against abstraction. Without the names, the Bennington case would become only a foggy idea. With them, it remains human. And humanity is what makes detective work more than puzzle solving. A puzzle exists to be solved. A cold case exists because someone is missing from the world in a way the world has not explained. That difference matters. You can enjoy a puzzle. You must care for a cold case. Tonight's slow tone comes from that care, from the recognition that every unanswered line in the file once touched a living household. The Bennington files also ask us to think about what it means to know a place. Rivers knew the woods. Local searchers knew the roads. Families knew habits. College friends knew routines. Yet knowing has layers, and a person can vanish between them. A place known by daylight may become different at dusk. A road known by car may feel different on foot. A trail known in summer may confuse in snow or wet leaves. You can feel those layers when you imagine walking near the Long Trail entrance in early December. The air is thin. The trees are mostly bare. Sound carries in odd ways. A passing vehicle seems loud, then gone. Your own footsteps on gravel become the main rhythm. If someone walked ahead of you, they might remain visible for a while, then disappear around a bend that looks harmless. Investigators trying to reconstruct that walk would need to consider clothing, daylight, temperature, and intention. Was Paula prepared for distance? Did she expect to return soon? Did anyone know her exact plan? Those questions remain partly open, and each opening weakens certainty. You can see why the case resisted the clean lines of official closure. The bus route offers another sensory world. Warm interior air, cold windows, the rocking motion that can make passengers drowsy, conversation fading into engine noise, a driver focused forward, stops that feel routine until later, when each one must be examined as if it were a doorway in a locked house. Tedford's disappearance turns that ordinary ride into a sequence of unanswered moments. A farmyard offers still another world. Straw underfoot, animals shifting in stalls, a child close enough to be assumed safe, work taking attention because work must be done, the smell of feed and earth, the sudden realization that the child is not where he should be. Paul Jepson's part of the Bennington case lives in that small, heartbreaking change from ordinary to searching. The hunting ground around Middie rivers has its own texture. Cold air in the lungs, dry leaves, the weight of a firearm carried by others in the party, men spreading out or moving along with the confidence of familiarity, a guide perhaps stepping ahead, then uncertainty. The file cannot show the moment clearly, so you let the woods remain wide and unforced. Frieda Langer's walk brings water, damp clothing, and the practical decision to return. There is nothing unusual in wanting dry clothes. That plainness is what makes the disappearance hard. A simple return should have a simple ending. When it did not, searchers had to ask whether she lost her route, met some obstacle, or encountered something no one could later prove. The answer remained incomplete. As each sensory world appears, the Bennington case becomes less like one place and more like several rooms connected by a long hallway. You walk through them slowly. In one room, a college coat hangs near a door. In another, a bus seat holds abandoned belongings. In another, a farm gate stands open. In another, wet leaves gather along a trail. The hallway is memory. Detectives moved through that hallway with limited light. Some doors opened, others did not. Some rooms contained only a single clue, lying there without explanation. A good investigator does not pretend the hallway is brighter than it is. He carries the lamp a little farther, notes what he sees, and returns when there is reason to return. The Bennington case has invited return for many decades because it remains poised between the explainable and the unexplained. It is not impossible to imagine ordinary answers. It is also not possible to prove them cleanly. That tension keeps people reading. For our purposes tonight, it also creates a steady rhythm, a back and forth between fact and uncertainty, like a slow pendulum in a darkened room. A slow pendulum can be restful. It does not demand action. It simply marks time. The case has marked time in this way since the 1940s and 1950s, through generations of retelling. Each swing brings us back to the same questions, but perhaps with a little more compassion than before. Compassion is a kind of progress, even when facts do not change. You can feel that compassion in the way we avoid easy blame. Searchers may have missed things, but they searched. Witnesses may have erred, but they spoke. Investigators may have lacked tools, but they used what they had. Families may have criticized, but they were grieving. Communities may have told stories, but they were trying to hold something difficult. The Bennington case asks for that balanced kindness. Balanced kindness does not mean accepting every claim. It means refusing contempt. A detective can be skeptical without being cold. You can ask hard questions in a soft voice. Was this detail contemporary? Did this witness have a reason to be certain? Does this route fit the time? Could the same source have influenced multiple accounts? These questions are firm, but they do not need sharp edges. The file may include things that lead nowhere, and those dead ends are part of the story too. A reported sighting that proves mistaken, a search area that yields nothing, a theory checked and set aside, a name that appears once and never again. You and I can pass them quietly, like rooms where the lights were turned on, inspected, and then left behind. Cold case work is full of such rooms. The public often sees only the main hallway. Detectives know the side rooms, the closets, the stairs that lead nowhere, the locked doors with no key. They know how much effort can disappear into a sentence like no further information was developed. That sentence can contain weeks of work. It can contain years. In Bennington, no further information was developed again and again, not because people wanted emptiness, but because emptiness kept returning. A lead would open, then close. A possible sighting would fade. A theory would fail to touch evidence. Search ground would remain silent. The file thickened, but the answer did not. You can feel the weight of that distinction. There is a soft sadness in a thick file with no resolution. It suggests care without completion. It shows that people tried enough to leave records, but not enough was found to end the question. The thickness itself can become a kind of memorial, not officially, but practically. Here are the pages made because someone mattered. Here are the efforts preserved because absence demanded response. The Bennington case may be best understood in that practical memorial sense. It is a record of absence, yes, but also a record of response. Searchers on trails, officers at desks, families asking, communities remembering, later readers returning. Each response is limited, and each still matters. The old folder holds them together without pretending they solved what they could not solve. You turn now to the question of why old mysteries sometimes feel peaceful to revisit at night, even when their subject is sad. Perhaps it is because the urgent part has passed. We are no longer in the first search with cold hands and rising fear. We are in the archive afterward, where we can honor the effort and hold the uncertainty gently. The Bennington case becomes a place for contemplation, not alarm. That does not lessen the seriousness. It changes the posture. You are not running through woods with a lantern. You are sitting with the file beside a small lamp, letting the old facts arrange themselves at a human pace. You are allowed to be tired. You are allowed to let a sentence soften. The case does not need you to solve it tonight. The detectives who worked it may have wished for just one decisive fact, a confirmed later sighting, a recovered object in a meaningful place, a witness who came forward with specific knowledge, a trail that led all the way. Without that, they had to live with probability and possibility. Those are useful investigative tools, but they are not closure. Probability might say one explanation is more likely than another. Possibility might keep another door from closing. In the Bennington case, both were present. Some explanations were more grounded for certain disappearances, especially those involving difficult terrain. Others remained possible because the evidence was too thin to exclude them. The result was not a solved case, but a carefully managed uncertainty. Managed uncertainty is an underrated part of detective work. It means knowing what you do not know and keeping that ignorance organized. It means preserving notes so someone later can understand the limits. It means not overstating a theory to comfort the public or yourself. It means allowing a case to remain open because closing it falsely would be a second harm. You can see how that applies here. To say with certainty that every Bennington disappearance was an accident would exceed the record. To say with certainty that they were all connected would also exceed it. To say detectives faced a cluster of unresolved disappearances with limited evidence and difficult conditions is less dramatic, but more faithful. Faithfulness is the tone we keep. The physical act of faithfulness may be as simple as turning one page at a time. You do not skip the dull forms. You do not linger only on the strange details. You read the search notes, the route descriptions, the names of roads, the times when known. The dullness is part of truth. It keeps the case from floating away. A road name can be an anchor. A date can be an anchor. A weather note can be an anchor. The 1st of December, 1946, is an anchor for Paula Welden. The 1st of December, 1949, is an anchor for James Tedford. The 12th of October, 1950, is an anchor for Paul Jepson. Anchors do not explain the sea, but they keep you from drifting. You hold those anchors lightly because exactness must still be humble. Dates can be known while meanings are not. Places can be marked while paths are unclear. A last sighting can be reliable without telling the final story. In the Bennington case, exact details often stand beside wide unknowns, and the contrast gives the file its quiet ache. There is also the matter of age. As decades pass, a case becomes harder to solve in ordinary ways, but sometimes easier to view clearly. Emotions settle. Rumors can be traced. Records can be compared. Later investigators may see patterns or inconsistencies that earlier ones missed because they were too close. But age also takes witnesses, changes places, and removes chances that once existed. So time is both archivist and thief. It preserves some pages and steals some voices. It fades ink but clarifies context. It makes a case famous and also makes it harder to check. The Bennington case has lived under that double influence for a very long while. You can almost hear time moving through the file, like air through shelves. If a later detective wished to reopen it formally, the first task would be inventory. What original reports survive? Where are the physical records? Which agencies hold which files? Are there photographs, maps, or correspondence not yet reviewed? Are any witness statements first-hand? Did later writers introduce details that cannot be traced? This is quiet work, but it is foundational. Only after inventory could analysis begin. Timelines would be rebuilt. Locations would be mapped with caution. Search areas would be compared against terrain. Possible unidentified remains records might be checked, though the usefulness would vary by case. Family histories could be reviewed for voluntary disappearance theories, again with care. Each step would take time, and each might produce only a little light. The Bennington case would resist even modern review because many needed materials may be missing, dispersed, or never created. That is not unusual for old cases. It is a reality of paper systems, local record keeping, and changing agencies. You can think of every missing document as another small absence inside the larger absence. The file has gaps about gaps. Still, sometimes old cases surprise investigators. A misplaced folder appears. A retired officer's notes are donated. A family preserves a letter. An archive holds a clipping that clarifies a timeline. A map in one collection answers a question raised by another. You never assume the final word has been found, just because the answer has not. Patience leaves a door open. In tonight's room, that door remains open only a little, enough for air, not enough for a dramatic entrance. We are not waiting for a sudden revelation. We are noticing how the work continues in small possibilities. A cold case can breathe through those small openings. The Bennington case has done that for many years, sometimes in official silence, sometimes in public memory. The public memory often returns to Glastonbury as a kind of symbolic center. Its history as an abandoned town gives the case a setting that feels ready-made for mystery. But if you look at it as a detective, you see a different significance. Abandoned places can make navigation harder, reduce witnesses, complicate search routes, and attract stories. The practical and the atmospheric overlap there. You can walk an old road and feel both. Under your boots, packed earth and leaves. At the edge, stones that may once have bordered a foundation. Above, bare branches moving in a light wind. In your mind, a search party passes through many years earlier. The place does not explain itself, but it holds the feeling of being looked through repeatedly without giving back enough. Glastonbury's abandoned quality may have made later stories easier to believe, yet the disappearances did not all occur within a single ruined street or simple boundary. The geography is broader, and the public phrase is broader still. A detective would resist letting one evocative place swallow the whole map. You and I resist it too. We keep the map open. Keeping the map open means returning to Bennington College for Paula, to the soldier's home and bus route for Tedford, to the family farm area for Paul, to the hunting terrain for Rivers, and to the Somerset Reservoir region for Frieda. Each location has its own investigative logic. The Bennington case is not a single dot. It is a constellation, and constellations are shapes we draw between distant lights. That image is gentle, but it carries a warning. The stars do not know the lines we draw. The cases may not know the pattern we place over them. Detectives have to determine whether the lines were meaningful or only human. That is one reason the case could never be cracked as a whole. The whole may be partly an act of memory, yet memory itself is worthy of study. Why did these disappearances stay together in the public mind? Why did Bennington become the name people attached to them? Why did certain details endure while others faded? Those questions do not solve the missing persons cases, but they help explain the case as we receive it now. You are reading not only the events, but the long life of their telling. The telling has often favored strangeness, because strangeness is easy to remember. A man vanishing from a bus, a student walking into winter, a guide lost in known woods, a child gone from a farm, a woman found later after searches. Each phrase is memorable, but behind each phrase are ordinary records, ordinary people, and the slow work of trying to know what happened. Tonight, the slow work matters more than the memorable phrase. You feel the folder under your hand. The cardboard is slightly rough. The metal fasteners, if there are any, feel cool at the tips of your fingers. The pages resist being turned too quickly. This imagined tactility keeps us with the file, not above it. It keeps us from floating into pure legend. The Bennington case also invites reflection on how investigation handles humility in public. People often want officials to speak with confidence. Families may need reassurance. Reporters may ask direct questions, but an honest investigator may have to say, "We do not know." Those words are hard. They can sound inadequate, yet they may be the only truthful words available. We do not know where Paula went after the last reliable sightings. We do not know precisely how Tedford left the known record. We do not know what happened to Paul Jepson. We do not know the full circumstances of River's disappearance or Langer's final route. These statements are not a conclusion tonight. They are working truths, the ground from which any careful inquiry must begin. Starting from "we do not know" can feel like standing in an empty room. But the room is not empty for long. You bring in maps, dates, weather, witness statements, search notes, and context. You arrange them gently. You see where the gaps remain. The Bennington case becomes not a blank, but a room with furniture placed far apart, leaving shadowed spaces between. Those shadowed spaces are where speculation gathers. Some speculation may be harmless, a listener wondering quietly. Some may be less helpful, turning real people into puzzle pieces. We choose the quiet kind, and even then we keep it modest. What might have happened is not the same as what did. That distinction is a blanket we draw over the room to keep it calm. A detective could build several possible narratives for each disappearance. Paula may have become lost, left voluntarily, met someone, or had an accident. Tedford may have left the bus unobserved, been misremembered by passengers, suffered confusion, or encountered circumstances not recorded. Rivers may have misstepped, become ill, or moved beyond the search area. Each narrative has room. None has enough furniture to live in fully. That metaphor may be soft, but the analytical point is firm. Possibility without supporting evidence cannot solve a case. A possible story must be tested against known facts, and the Bennington facts are too sparse to choose decisively. This is not because the story lacks interest, it is because the evidence lacks weight. Detectives could not responsibly invent the missing weight. The public, less bound by responsibility, sometimes fills the gaps. That is understandable. But tonight, your role is more like the quiet detective than the storyteller chasing effect. You review, you compare, you keep the names clear. You let silence remain silence. There is a dignity in that, and a restfulness too, because no part of the file has to be forced. The old office grows later. The lamp's shade is warm to the touch. Outside, perhaps the rain has stopped, and only water from the eaves makes a soft occasional sound. You have been with the Bennington case for a long while now, and still it has not hurried. It sits beside you the way old files do, with its questions folded in paper and its answers absent. Now, as we move deeper into the patient mechanics of why the case endured, we should look at one more layer. The way each investigation depended on the cooperation of ordinary people who had no reason, until afterward, to know that their ordinary observations might become important. Ordinary people are often the last soft edge of a cold case, because they see without knowing they are seeing, and they remember without knowing memory will one day be asked to carry so much. You can sit with that gently now, with the Bennington file resting under your hands, and feel how human the whole mystery has always been. A driver watching the road, a student noticing a coat, a searcher pausing among wet leaves, a family member listening for a door that does not open. The Bennington case was never cracked in any final settled way. No single explanation was ever proven for the disappearances gathered under that name, and no one was ever charged in a way that answered them. Frieda was found, but the full path of her final hours never became clear, while Middie Rivers, Paula Welden, James Tedford, and Paul Jepson remained unresolved in the record, their absences still held by old files, old roads, and the long patience of those who kept remembering. So we leave it honestly, not as a puzzle with a hidden key waiting in the last line, but as a quiet Vermont mystery that time has not fully opened. You can let the papers settle now. The maps can be folded without being solved. The lamp can keep its small circle of warmth a little longer, while outside, the hills of Bennington County rest in darkness, holding their old paths, their winter air, and the questions that never learned how to speak. And for tonight, you do not have to follow those paths any farther. The file remains where it is, open enough for memory, quiet enough for rest, and the unanswered names can stay beneath the soft light while the room grows still.